The ship was falling apart, and there was nothing Elias Varn could do about it. He pulled every lever and slammed every button on the console, but the reactor warning kept screaming at him in bright red letters, and the whole cockpit shook like a tin can rolling down a mountain. And through the cracked viewport he could see the green and violet surface of the planet rushing up to meet him like a fist. "Come on, come on, come on," he whispered through his teeth, as he tried to angle the nose up just enough to turn a death crash into something survivable. The survey corvette Sparrowhawk had been a good ship once, but that was before the reactor fall tore through its belly like a hot knife, and now it was nothing more than a burning metal coffin screaming through the atmosphere of a world called Valira 4. Elias braced himself, and the ship hit the tree line. The sound was beyond anything he had ever heard in his life, and that included 2 tours in the outer colonies, where things exploded on a regular basis, and the Sparrowhawk carved a path through a forest of trees so massive that each trunk was wider than a house, and branches the size of highways shattered against the hull, and the ship spun and rolled and tore the earth open for what felt like 100 miles before it finally came to a stop, buried halfway into the ground at the edge of a wide golden plain. Silence came after that, and it was the loudest silence Elias had ever known. He hung upside down in his harness, bleeding from a cut above his eye, and breathing hard, and his ears were ringing, and his ribs screamed at him every time he took a breath. But he was alive, and that alone felt like a miracle. He cut himself free and fell to the ceiling, which was now the floor, and crawled through the wreckage until he found the emergency hatch and kicked it open, and the air of Valera 4 hit him like a warm, sweet wave that smelled of flowers he had no name for. The sky above, violet with streaks of pale gold, and everything was enormous, and Elias, who stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall on Earth, suddenly felt like a child standing in a world built for something much, much bigger than him. The trees were hundreds of feet tall, and the grass of the savanna came up to his chest, and the insects that buzzed around the wreckage were the size of his hand. And somewhere in the distance, something roared, and the ground trembled. He grabbed what he could from the ship before it became too dangerous to go back inside, and he managed to pull out his medkit and his translation matrix and a few ration packs and his portable scanner, and that was it, and the rest of his life was burning behind him. He sat on a rock and looked at the mess he was in, and tried very hard not to panic. No distress signal had gone out before the crash, and the nearest UEN outpost was 14 star systems away, and nobody was coming for him, and he was alone on an uncharted alien world, with nothing but a few tools and a splitting headache. That was when he heard the footsteps. They were not normal footsteps, and each one made the ground shake just a little, and they were coming from the tree line, and they were getting closer. And Elias grabbed the only thing that could pass for a weapon, which was a heavy wrench, and he stood up and turned around, and his mouth fell open. She was tall. Not tall the way a basketball player is tall, or tall the way a building is tall, but somewhere in between. And she stood at least 10 feet high, with skin the color of dark bronze that seemed to glow in the fading light, and her eyes were large and golden like twin suns, and her hair was thick and black and fell past her shoulders like a river of night, and she was built like a warrior goddess from some ancient myth that humans had long forgotten. She carried a spear made from some kind of bone that was longer than Elias was tall, and she wore armor made of leather, carved stone, and behind her stood 4 more like her, each one massive and beautiful and terrifying, and every single one of them was staring at Elias like he was the strangest thing they had ever seen, which he probably was. The one in front tilted her head and said something in a language that sounded like rolling thunder mixed with singing, and Elias fumbled with his translation matrix and held it up, and it crackled and sputtered because it was damaged. But after a few seconds, It gave him a rough translation. "What is this small creature?" Elias swallowed hard and tried to stand as tall as he could, which was laughable given the circumstances, and he said, "My name is Elias Varn, and I come in peace, and I would really appreciate it if you did not stab me with that spear." The translation matrix buzzed and converted his words into their language, and the lead warrior blinked, and then her mouth curved into what might have been a smile, and she spoke again, "Talks." The others behind her murmured, and one of them laughed, and it was a deep, warm sound that Elias felt in his chest, and he decided that being laughed at was much better than being stabbed. The lead warrior stepped closer and crouched down to get a better look at him, and even crouching, she was still taller than him, and she studied his face with those golden eyes, and there was no hostility in them, only a burning curiosity, and something else that Elias could not quite name. She said her name was Thyra, and she was a hunter of the Aelori clan, and she asked him where he had fallen from. "Up there," Elias said, and pointed at the sky. Thyra looked up and then back at him, and her expression changed, and the curiosity was still there, but now it was joined by something that looked like wonder, and maybe hope. She spoke to the others in rapid words the translator could not keep up with, and then she turned back to Elias and said something that the matrix translated. "You will come with us, and you will meet the mother of our clan, and you will not be harmed, little one, and I give you my word." Then she picked him up. She just picked him up like he weighed nothing at all, and tucked him against her side the way a mother might carry a child. And Elias tried to protest, but she was already walking, and the other warriors fell into step behind her, and the forest swallowed them all. They walked for what felt like hours, and the world grew darker and more beautiful, and glowing plants lit the forest floor in shades of blue and green. And Elias eventually stopped struggling and just watched. And when they finally emerged from the trees, he saw it. The Aelori settlement was carved into the face of a great mountain, and it was breathtaking, and massive stone halls rose in tiers connected by wide stairs and open courtyards. And everywhere there were Veliani women, and all of them were giants, and all of them were beautiful. Stopped what they were doing to stare at the tiny creature Thyra carried in her arms. Elias was brought to the highest hall, where the air was cool and smelled of incense, and there on a throne carved from a single piece of crystal sat the oldest and most magnificent of them all. Matriarch Selune was ancient, and her skin was deep black, with veins of silver running through it like rivers on a map, and her eyes were white and glowing, and she looked at Elias the way someone looks at a prayer that has finally been answered. She spoke, and her voice was soft, but it filled the entire hall. "You are welcome here, small one, and you are an answer carried by the stars," she said. Elias, still hanging in Thyra's grip with his dignity in tatters, managed to ask, "An answer to what exactly?" Selune's glowing eyes dimmed just slightly, and a sadness crossed her face that was so deep and so old that Elias felt it in his bones. "You will understand soon," she said, "what we have lost." Elias did not sleep well that first night. They gave him a room carved into the mountain stone, and the bed was made for someone 3 times his size, so he felt like a child sleeping on a football field. The blankets were soft and warm, and smelled like wildflowers, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ground rushing up through the cockpit window, and heard the terrible sound of the sparrowhawk dying around him. When morning came, the violet sky brightened to a soft lavender, and golden light poured through the open window. Elias sat up and looked out over the Aelori settlement, and tried to understand where he was and what was happening to him. Thyra came for him at dawn. She ducked through the doorway, which was enormous by human standards, but still required her to lower her head. She carried a wooden plate piled with fruits and cooked grains, and something that looked like honey. She set it down in front of him, and sat cross-legged on the floor, watched him eat with an expression that sat somewhere between amusement and fascination. "You eat like a bird," she said through the translation matrix. "You are literally 4 times my size," Elias replied. "Everything I do is going to look small to you." Thyra smiled, and it transformed her face from fierce warrior to something worn and open. And Elias noticed for the first time that her smile was slightly crooked, and that she had a thin scar running from her left ear to the corner of her jaw, and somehow both of those things made her more real to him. After he ate, she told him the matriarch wanted to show him something, and there was a weight in the way she said it that made Elias uneasy. Thyra led him through the settlement, and everywhere they went, the Villani stopped to look at him, and some whispered, and some pointed, and a few of the younger ones giggled, and one tiny girl, who was still taller than Elias, reached out and touched his hair with enormous gentle fingers, and then ran away shrieking with laughter. But Elias was paying attention now, and he began to notice things. He noticed that there were no men, not a single one. Every face he saw was female, and every voice he heard was female, and every warrior and builder and cook and elder was a woman. And at first he thought maybe the men lived somewhere else, or maybe they were out hunting, but the deeper they went into the settlement, the more obvious it became that there simply were no males here at all. He also noticed the children. There were so few of them, and the ones he saw were thin and pale compared to the adults, and some of them coughed, and some of them moved slowly as if their bodies were too tired, and the mothers who watched over them had the look of people who were used to being afraid. Thyra brought him to the base of the mountain, where a great stone doorway led into the rock itself, and 2 ancient warriors stood guard, with spears crossed. When they saw Thyra and the small creature beside her, they uncrossed their spears and stepped aside. Inside was a long tunnel, lit by glowing crystals embedded in the walls, and the air was cool and still, and it felt like walking into a church, or a tomb, or maybe both. They emerged into a vast underground chamber, and Matriarch Saloon was waiting for them, along with an older woman who was introduced as Elder Omira, the spiritual leader of the clan. This place was called the Hall of Echoes. The walls were covered in carvings from floor to ceiling, and they stretched back into the darkness, farther than Elias could see, and each carving depicted a generation of the Aelori clan, and the oldest carvings near the entrance showed men and women together, standing tall and proud and strong, and every face was different, and every body was unique, and there was a wild, beautiful diversity to them that spoke of a people who were thriving. But as Elias walked deeper into the hall, carvings changed. The men began to disappear, and first there were fewer of them, and then there were almost none, and then they were gone completely. And the women who remained began to look more and more alike, and the diversity faded, and the faces became copies of copies, and the bodies grew thinner, and the children in the carvings grew fewer. The newest carvings at the far end of the hall were almost identical to each other, and they depicted women who looked like mirrors of one another, and the children carved beside them were small and frail. Elias stood in front of those final carvings and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Now you see," Seiluun said quietly. Elder Omira stepped forward, and she was old beyond counting, with white hair that touched the ground, and eyes that had seen centuries, and she spoke slowly and carefully, so the translation matrix could keep up. She told Elias the story. Long ago, the Viliani had been a complete people with men and women and children, born strong and different and alive. And then something changed, deep beneath the earth, and the great volcanoes that lined the southern ridge began to release a poison into the air and the water and the soil, and it was slow and invisible, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was too late. The poison attacked the males first, and it made them unable to father children, and over many generations, fewer and fewer boys were born until none were born at all, and the last male Vianney died more than 80 years ago. And Omira had been a young woman then, and she remembered his name, and the sound of his voice, and the way the whole world seemed to grow quieter after he was gone. Without males, the Vianney had found another way, and through sheer force of will and ancient ritual, they learned to reproduce on their own. And the word Elias would have used was parthenogenesis, and it meant that each mother essentially cloned herself, and for a while worked, and daughters were born, and life continued. But clones of clones of clones could not last forever. Each generation was a little weaker and a little more fragile, and the immune systems grew less effective, and sickness came more often, and the children took longer to grow, and some did not grow at all. And the genetic diversity that once made the Veliani strong was almost completely gone, and what remained was a fading echo of what they had been. "We are dying," Selûne said, and there was no drama in her voice, only a simple, terrible truth. "Not today, and not tomorrow, but soon, and our daughters will be the last, and their daughters will never be born, and the Aelori will become carvings on a wall, and nothing more." Elias looked at the ancient carvings, and then at the newest ones, and then at Selûne, and then at Thyra, who stood behind him with her jaw tight, and her golden eyes bright with something she refused to let fall. "What do you want from me?" he asked, even, though some part of him already knew. Omira answered, and her old voice rang through the hall of echoes like a bell. "Our prophecies speak of a small one who falls from beyond the sky carrying the seed of renewal, and you are here, and you are small, and you fell from the sky, and we are asking you, Elias Varn, to help us live." The weight of it hit him like a ship crashing into a planet. They were asking him to father children with them. He opened his mouth, and closed it, and opened it again, and his face went through about 7 different colors, and his brain tried to process the request and crashed about as hard as the sparrowhawk had. "I am not even the same species as you," he finally managed. "And yet here you are," Selûne said. Thyra stepped forward, and she crouched down so she could look him in the eye, and this close he could see flecks of amber in her golden irises, and the quiet desperation she carried behind her calm face. She said, "That is fine, and I understand, and no one will force you to do anything. But understand this, and hear me clearly, Elias Varn, and we are not asking out of desire or selfishness, or because we see you as a tool to be used, and we are asking because our daughters are dying, and because we have no pride left, and all we have is love for those who might come after us. And if you cannot help us, then we will accept that, and we will die with whatever grace we have left. But we had to ask, and we could not let the chance pass without asking." Elias said nothing for a long time, and the crystals on the walls glowed softly, and the carvings of the dead watched from the stone. Then he turned and walked out of the Hall of Echoes without a word, and Thyra let him go. He went back to the wreckage of his ship, because it was the only place on this whole planet that felt familiar, and he sat in the broken cockpit and stared at his hands, and tried to think. Then he turned on the med scanner. It was damaged, but it still worked well enough, and he had collected biological samples during his time in the settlement, without even meaning to, and skin cells from the blankets, and traces from the food, and he fed them into the scanner, and asked it to compare Veliani DNA with human DNA. The results took 20 minutes to compile, and when they appeared on the cracked screen, Elias read them 3 times, because he was sure he was wrong. He was not wrong. Veliani DNA and human DNA shared a core genetic template that was far too similar to be coincidence, and the compatibility index was off the charts, and the scanner estimated a reproductive success probability of over 90%, and the projected offspring would be genetically robust and healthy and strong. Elias stared at the screen and whispered a word that was not appropriate for polite company. Somewhere millions of years ago, humans and Veliani had come from the same seed, scattered across the stars by something or someone long forgotten, and they were not the same species, but they were family, in the deepest, oldest sense of the word. He sat in the wreckage of his ship on a planet 14 star systems from home, and realized that the universe had just asked him a question that he could not ignore. Elias spent 3 days at the wreckage of his ship, and Phyra came every morning to bring him food. And every morning he told her he needed more time, and every morning she nodded and left without pushing him, and he respected her for that, more than he could say. He ran the genetic analysis over and over again because he kept hoping he was wrong, and every time the scanner told him the same thing, and the numbers did not lie, and Velani and human DNA were compatible, and the children would be strong and healthy, and the math was certain, even if Elias was not. On the second day he pulled up the UEN first contact protocols on his datapad, and read them front to back, and they were very clear, and they said an officer of the United Earth Navy shall not interfere with the natural development of any alien civilization under any circumstances, and the penalty for violation was court-martial and imprisonment, and the loss of everything he had worked for. On the third day he put the datapad down and walked outside and watched a group of Velyani children playing in the golden grass below the mountain, and there were only 6 of them, and the oldest moved slowly and carefully, as though her bones were made of glass, and the youngest sat apart from the others, coughing into her hands, and their mothers watched from a distance, with eyes full of a fear so deep it had become part of who they were. Elias thought about protocols and rules and regulations, and then he thought about those children, and he knew what he was going to do, and maybe he had known since the moment Omira told him the truth in the Hall of Echoes. But before he went back, he needed to understand more, and so he spent hours with the scanner, studying the genetic data and building models and running simulations, and what he found amazed him. The compatibility was not just about reproduction, and it went deeper than that, and the Velyani genome was extraordinary in its own right, with markers for incredible physical strength and enhanced immune response and cellular regeneration that far exceeded anything in human biology. And when he modeled what a hybrid offspring might look like, the results were stunning. The children would inherit the Velyani physical form, and their height and their strength and their beauty, but they would also carry human genetic diversity like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for centuries, and that diversity would cascade through future generations, repairing the damage that cloning had done, and rebuilding the immune systems, and restoring the variation that made a species capable of surviving. In simple terms, the Velyani did not just need him for reproduction, and they needed the genetic diversity that only an outside source could provide. And Elias happened to be that source, and whether it was fate, or prophecy, or just dumb luck, he was here and he could help. He walked back to the settlement on the evening of the 3rd day. The sun was setting, and the violet sky had turned to deep purple, streaked with rivers of gold, and the crystal formations on the mountain caught the light and scattered it into 1,000 colors. And Elias walked through the great stone gate, and every Velyani he passed turned to watch him, and he could feel their eyes on him like a physical weight. Phyra met him at the entrance to the matriarch's hall, and she looked at his face, and something in his expression must have told her what he had decided, because her golden eyes widened and her breath caught, and for just a moment the fierce warrior disappeared, and the woman underneath showed through. "You are sure?" she said. "Take me to saloon," he said. The great hall was full, because word had spread, and the entire clan had gathered, and hundreds of Velyani women filled the space, and they sat on stone benches, and stood along the walls, and hung from the upper galleries, and every pair of golden eyes was fixed on the tiny human who walked down the center aisle toward the crystal throne. Seiluun sat waiting, and Omira stood beside her, and the two of them looked like monuments carved from time itself. Elias stopped in front of them, and he was so small compared to everything around him, and the ceiling was 100 feet above his head, and the nearest Veliani could have crushed him with one hand. And he had never felt more exposed in his life. But he was not afraid. He activated his translation matrix, and spoke, and his voice was steady, even if his heart was hammering. I have studied your blood and your bones, and the deep code of your bodies, and I have compared it to my own, and what I found is that your people and my people are not strangers, and somewhere a very long time ago we came from the same place. And we are different now, yes, but we are still family in the oldest way. The hall was silent. The children that could come from this would be strong. They would carry your strength, and your beauty and your spirit, but they would also carry something new, and something different, and that difference is what will save you. Because it is not weakness that is killing your people, and it is sameness. And what you need more than anything is change. He paused and looked around the hall, at all those faces, and he saw hope and fear, and doubt, and desperation, and love, and he took a breath, and said the words that would change everything. I will help you, and I am not doing this because of your prophecy, and I am not doing this because I feel sorry for you, and I am doing this because I have lived among you, and I have seen who you are, and you are a people worth saving, and I will not stand by and watch you disappear. For a moment, nothing happened, and the silence stretched out like a held breath. Then Seluine rose from her throne, and she was magnificent and terrifying and ancient, and she descended the steps and crossed the floor until she stood over Elias, and she was so tall that he had to crane his neck all the way back to see her face. And then she knelt. The matriarch of the Aelori clan knelt before him. She placed her enormous hand over both of his, and her skin was warm and rough, and her fingers could have wrapped around him twice. And she whispered a blessing in her own language that the translator could not fully capture, but the feeling behind it needed no translation. Then the hall erupted. Warriors wept openly, and they were women who had faced beasts the size of buildings without flinching. But this small man and his quiet words broke something open inside them, and the sound of their crying was like rain on stone. And the younger women embraced each other, and the children who were present looked around in confusion, not understanding why everyone was crying, but sensing that something important had happened. Elias stood in the middle of it all, feeling overwhelmed, terrified, and then Thyra was beside him. And she put her hand on his shoulder, and her hand covered his entire shoulder and half his back. And she said, "You are the bravest small creature I've ever known. Please stop calling me small. When you stop being small, I will stop calling you small." He laughed, and she laughed, and the sound of their laughter mixed together felt like the beginning of something real. Over the following weeks, things changed between Elias and the Veliani, and especially between Elias and Thyra. She was assigned as his guardian, which meant she was with him almost every waking moment, and at first it was purely practical, because she kept him safe in a world where even the insects could knock him over, and she carried him across rivers and lifted him over walls, and once pulled him out of the path of a charging beast with one hand while holding her spear in the other. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. Thyra about the stars, and he drew maps of constellations in the dirt, and told her about Earth and its blue oceans and white clouds, and she listened with her chin on her knees and her golden eyes wide, and she asked 1,000 questions, and each question was smarter than the last. Thyra taught Elias to climb the crystal cliffs that rose behind the settlement, and she was patient with him, even though it took him an hour to climb what she could climb in minutes. And when he finally reached the top, she was sitting there waiting with that crooked smile, and she said, "Not bad for a small creature." And he was too out of breath to argue. He helped the clan in other ways too, and this was where being human became something extraordinary. The Veliani were strong beyond imagination, but they had never developed certain kinds of thinking, and Elias showed them how to build a lever system that let one person move stones that normally required 10. And he designed a simple irrigation channel that doubled the yield of their grain fields. And he treated a warrior's infected wound with antiseptic from his medkit, and the wound healed in days instead of weeks. And they looked at him like he was performing magic. He was not magic, and he knew that, and he was just a man with a different way of seeing problems. But to the Veliani, who had strength and endurance and beauty beyond measure, his small, clever mind was the most astonishing thing they had ever encountered. One evening, Thyra sat beside him on the terrace overlooking the valley, and the sky was full of unfamiliar stars. And she said, "My people can move mountains, but you can make the mountains move themselves, and I think that is more impressive." And Elias looked at her, and realized that somewhere between the star maps and the cliff climbing and the long evenings talking about everything and nothing, he had fallen in love with this impossible giant woman who could crush him like a grape, but instead held him like he was made of gold. But not everyone was happy. A voice rang out across the hall during the next council meeting, and it belonged to Cassivra, who was the tallest and strongest warrior in the clan, and she stood like a tower of dark stone, and her eyes burned with a fury that was rooted not in hatred, but in wounded pride. "We are daughters of the mountain," Cassivra declared, and her voice shook the walls. "We do not beg scraps from the sky, and this small creature is not our savior, and he is our shame." Cassivra's words hit the great hall like a boulder dropped from the sky, and the silence that followed was heavy and sharp, and every eye moved between her and Elias, and the tension was so thick it had a taste. She was not evil, and Elias understood that, even as his stomach dropped, and she was not cruel, and she was not selfish, and she was something far more dangerous than any of those things, and she was proud, and she was grieving, and she was terrified that her people would survive only by becoming something less than what they were. "Look at him," Cassivra said, and she pointed one massive finger at Elias, who stood among the gathered Veliani, like a single blade of grass in a field of ancient trees. "He is smaller than our children, and weaker than our sick, and you would have our future flow from his blood, and you would make the daughters of the mountain into daughters of this, and I say no, and I say we die as ourselves before we live as something we do not recognize." Murmur rolled through the hall, and Elias could feel the tribes splitting like a crack running through ice, and some nodded with Cassivra, and some shook their heads, and some simply looked lost. Matriarch Saloon raised her hand, and the hall went quiet. "You have the right to speak, Cassivra, and your words come from love, and I hear them, but the decision has been made by council and by the will of the people." "Then I invoke the old law," Cassivra said, and her voice was like a drum. The hall gasped, and even Saloon's ancient composure cracked for just a moment. Cassivra had called for the right of worth. Thyra was at Elias's side in an instant, and she leaned down and her voice was low and tight, and she explained quickly, and the right of worth was an ancient trial that any outsider had to pass before being accepted into the blood of the clan, and it had not been invoked in living memory because there had been no outsiders in living memory. Not even the matriarch could refuse it. "What does the trial involve?" Elias asked. Thyra told him, and he went pale. The right of worth had 3 trials, and they were called the trial of stone, and the trial of fang, and the trial of heart, and they were designed for Veliani warriors and beings of immense size and incredible strength. And Elias was a human being who weighed about 180 pounds. "I will speak against this," Thyra said, and her hand was on his shoulder, and her grip was tight enough to be almost painful. "I will challenge Cassivra myself before I let her put you through this." "No," Elias said. Thyra stared at him. "If I fail this trial, then she is right, and I do not belong here. And if I pass it, then no one can ever question my place among your people again. and either way the tribe stays whole, and that matters more than my safety." Thyra looked at him for a long time, and her golden eyes searched his face, and whatever she found there made her jaw tighten, and she nodded once and said, "You are the most stubborn small creature on any world." The first trial came at dawn. The trial of stone was simple in concept. A massive boulder sat at the base of the sacred peak, and the challenger had to move it to the top, and that was it. The boulder was the size of a small house, and it weighed more than Elias could calculate. Any Veliani warrior could lift it onto her shoulders and carry it up the slope in under an hour. Elias could not lift a single corner of it. The entire clan gathered to watch, and Cassavra stood with her arms crossed, and a grim satisfaction on her face, because this would be over before it started, and the small creature would fail, and the old law would be fulfilled, and things would return to the way they were meant to be. Elias walked around the boulder 3 times, and then he walked up the slope and came back down, and then he stood very still for a long time. The crowd murmured impatiently. Then he went to the tree line and started working. He cut branches and stripped them into long poles, using a sharp stone, and he found round logs and rolled them to the base of the boulder, and the Veliani watched in confusion as he arranged the logs beneath the boulder, and wedged a long pole under its edge, and then he pushed. The boulder moved. Not much, and not fast, but it moved, and Elias repositioned the logs and pushed again, and it moved further. And he had built a system of levers and rollers that turned his small human strength into a mechanical advantage that the Veliani had never imagined. And inch by inch, and hour by hour, he moved that massive stone up the sacred peak. It took him the entire day, and by the end, his hands were bleeding, and his muscles were screaming, and he could barely stand. But the boulder sat on the summit, and the clan was silent, and Cassivra's face had changed from satisfaction to something she could not. He had not cheated, and he had not broken any rule, and the trial said, "Move the boulder," and he moved the boulder, and the fact that he did it with his brain instead of his back did not make it any less real. Thyra was grinning so hard it looked like her face might break. The second trial came the next morning, and it was the trial of Fang. Elias was taken to the deep wilderness beyond the settlement's borders, and left alone with nothing, and the rules were simple. Survive 3 days, and if he came back alive, he passed, and if he did not, then the wilderness had judged him unworthy. The deep wilderness of Valera IV was not kind to small creatures, and the predators here were massive and fast and hungry, and the plants could be poisonous, and the rivers were filled with things that had too many teeth, and no creature the size of a human had any business being out here alone. But Elias was human, and humans had survived ice ages, and deserts, and oceans, vacuum of space, and they had done it, not because they were the biggest or the strongest, but because they absolutely refused to stop thinking. On the first day, he built a shelter in a tree, using vines and branches, and he wove it tight enough that nothing could reach him, and he started a fire, using friction and dry moss, and the fire kept the night predators at a distance, and he slept lightly with his back against the trunk. On the second day, he built traps, using bent saplings and cordage made from plant fibers, and he caught 2 small animals and cooked them over his fire, and he found a stream and tested the water with what remained of his medkit supplies before drinking, and he mapped the territory around his camp so he would know where danger was and where safety was. On the third day, the big predator found him. It was something like a cat and something like a bear, and it was 15 feet long, and its mouth was full of teeth the size of kitchen knives. Through the undergrowth, like a shadow made solid, and it was between Elias and his camp. The Veliani hunters who had been secretly watching from a distance to ensure the trial was observed held their breath because they were not allowed to intervene, and they were certain they were about to watch the small one die. Elias did not run, and he did not freeze, and he looked at the beast, and the beast looked at him, and then Elias did something that no Veliani would have thought to do. He made himself look bigger. He grabbed 2 branches and held them wide above his head, and he shouted at the top of his lungs, and the sound echoed through the forest. And the beast hesitated, because on Valera 4, nothing small had ever been this loud before. And while it hesitated, Elias grabbed a burning stick from his fire, and threw it, and the beast flinched and snarled, and Elias threw another, and yelled louder, and held his ground, and the beast decided that this tiny screaming fire-throwing creature was too much to handle. And it turned and ran. Thing was not worth the trouble, and it turned and disappeared into the trees. The hidden hunters looked at each other in stunned silence. When Elias walked back into the settlement on the 3rd evening, he was dirty and scratched and exhausted, and he carried enough food to share, and the clan stared at him as though he had walked out of a legend. The 3rd and final trial was the trial of heart, and it was held that same evening in the great hall before the full council, and this trial had no physical challenge, and instead the outsider had to stand before the people and speak a truth so deep and so real that it could not be denied. Elias stood in the center of the hall, and he was bruised and battered, and his hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, and he was so small among them that a child could have hidden him behind her legs. And he looked around at the faces of these incredible people who had taken him in and fed him and protected him and trusted him with their future. And he spoke the truth. "I am afraid," he said, and the translator carried his words to every corner of the hall. "I am afraid every single day, and I am afraid because I am small and breakable and far from home, and everything on this world is bigger than me and stronger than me, and I wake up every morning knowing that 100 things could kill me before lunch." He paused and looked at Cassivra, who stood with her arms folded and her face unreadable. "But where I come from we have a saying, and it goes like this, and it is not the size of the being in the fight, but the size of the fight in the being. And I have walked among giants, and I have never felt lesser, because you showed me that greatness is not measured in height, but in the size of a people's love for their children." His voice cracked, and he did not try to hide it. "You are not dying because you are weak, and you are dying because the universe was cruel to you, and you did nothing to deserve it. And I cannot undo that cruelty, but I can stand here and I can tell you that you are worth fighting for. And every single one of you is worth fighting for. And if my blood and my bones and my small stubborn human heart can give your daughters a chance to see tomorrow, then I give them freely, and not because a prophecy told me to, but because you are my people now, and I do not abandon my people." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Cassivra moved, and the hall tensed because no one knew what she would do. And she walked forward, and she was the tallest woman in the clan, and she towered over Elias like a monument, and she looked down at him, and her face was not angry anymore, and it was not proud, and it was something raw and broken and healed all at the same time. She knelt. The fiercest warrior of the Alori clan knelt before the smallest person in the room, and she bowed her head and said, "I was wrong, and you have more strength in your small body than I have ever carried in mine, and I am sorry." Elias reached up and placed his hand on top of her bowed head, and said, "You were not wrong to fight for your people's pride, and never apologize for that." And Cassivra looked up at him, and for the first time she smiled. That night the tribe held the Festival of New Stars, and drums echoed through the mountains, and fires blazed on every terrace, and the Veliani danced and sang and laughed, and it was a celebration that had not been performed in living memory, because it was the celebration of new life coming into the world. Thyra found Elias sitting on the edge of a terrace, watching the festival, and she sat beside him, and the music washed over them, and she said, "You passed the trial. I noticed. You also made Cassivra cry, and no one has ever done that. I am a man of many talents. She laughed, and the sound rolled through him like warm thunder, and she put her arm around him, and he leaned into her. The fires burned together, and high above them, hidden among the unfamiliar stars, a tiny point of light blinked once and moved slowly across the sky, and neither of them noticed it. The months that followed were the fullest of Elias Varn's life, and he had not known that a person could be so busy and so exhausted and so deeply happy, all at the same time. He and Thyra were bonded in a ceremony that lasted 3 days and involved rituals he did not fully understand, but participated in with his whole heart. And the clan painted his skin with sacred patterns, and Thyra wore a crown of crystal flowers, and Selwyn performed the binding words. And when it was done, Thyra lifted him off the ground and kissed him in front of the entire tribe, and the cheering shook the mountain. Life with Thyra was an adventure in scale, and everything about their relationship required creativity, because she was 10 feet tall and he was 6, and their home was built for her size, which meant Elias needed a step stool to reach the kitchen counter, and a running start to get into bed. And Thyra found this endlessly amusing, and he pretended to be annoyed, but secretly he loved the way she laughed. But beneath the joy there was a waiting, and a hoping, and a quiet fear, that maybe the science was wrong, and maybe the compatibility numbers were just numbers, and maybe the children would not come. Then one morning, Thyra sat very still at the edge of their bed, and her hand was pressed against her stomach, and her golden eyes were wide, and she said his name in a voice he had never heard her use before, and it was small, and wondering, and afraid. He ran the med scanner, and his hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it, and the screen flickered to life, and the readings came through, and Elias stared at them, and then looked at Thyra, and his eyes filled, and he could not speak, so he just nodded. She was pregnant. The sound Thyra made was not a word, and it was something beyond language, and it came from a place so deep inside her that it shook the walls, and she pulled Elias into her arms and held him against her chest, and he could feel her heartbeat thundering like a drum, and she was crying and laughing and saying his name over and over. The news spread through the settlement like fire through dry grass. Within days it became clear that Thyra was not the only one, and the med scanner confirmed 5 more pregnancies across the clan, and every single one was healthy, and the readings were extraordinary, and the genetic profiles showed exactly what Elias had predicted, and the children were Veliani in form, carrying their mother's height and strength and beauty, but woven into their DNA was a new thread of diversity that had not existed in the Elori bloodline for centuries. The children would be strong, and they would be different from each other, and they would have immune systems rebuilt from the ground up, and they would be the first generation in 100 years that was not a copy of the generation before. The tribe erupted into a joy so overwhelming that Elias could feel it in the air, like electricity. Who had carried grief their entire lives suddenly walked with their heads higher, and the elders who had accepted extinction as inevitable wept tears they had been holding back for decades, and the sick children in the settlement seemed to sense the change, and played with more energy than anyone had seen in years. Elias became something extraordinary to the Veliani, and they called him Varn Thay, which meant Little Father of the Mountain, and it was spoken with such warmth and reverence that it made his chest ache every time he heard it. He threw himself into his work, because there was so much to do, and the children were only part of the equation, and if the Elori were going to thrive, they needed more than new blood, and they needed new ideas. He designed an aqueduct system that brought fresh water from the mountain springs directly into the settlement, and the Veliani had always carried water by hand, because they were strong enough to do so, but Elias showed them that strength, spent carrying water, was strength that could be spent elsewhere. And when the first water flowed through the stone channels, the clan gathered to watch, as though he had pulled a river from thin air. He built a simple windmill on the ridge above the settlement, and used it to grind grain. And the process that once took hours of manual labor now happened on its own. And the Velyani stared at the spinning blades with the same wonder that Elias had felt when he first saw their crystal architecture. He started a library, and this was perhaps his most important contribution, because the Velyani had always passed knowledge through oral tradition and song, and Elias showed them how to make ink from local plants, and how to press flat sheets from bark fiber, and how to write things down so that knowledge could survive, even when the person who held it did not. And Omira, who had carried the entire history of the clan in her ancient memory, sat beside him for weeks, dictating everything she knew, while Elias wrote, and when they were finished, she placed her hand on the stack of pages and said, "Now I can rest." The seasons turned, and Thyra grew round and radiant, and she complained about everything, and told Elias it was entirely his fault, and he agreed with her, because he was wise enough to know that was the only correct response. And at night she curled around him like a warm mountain, and his hand rested on her belly, and sometimes he felt the baby kick, and the kick was strong enough to bruise his palm, and he laughed every time. Then the light in the sky came back. Elias was on the terrace when he saw it, and this time it was not a faint blinking point, but a bright streak cutting across the violet sky, and it was a ship, and it was coming down, and his blood went cold. The shuttle landed in the clearing near the Sparrowhawk's wreckage, and it bore the insignia of the UN, and a team of 8 soldiers in combat armor stepped out, led by a tall, stern woman with dark skin and sharp eyes, and she introduced herself as Commander Adaora Ose of the search and rescue vessel Halcyon. "Captain Elias Varn," she said, and her voice was military precision wrapped in barely concealed disbelief. "You are alive, and you have some explaining to do." They had found the Sparrowhawk's trajectory data in the UEN database, and when no contact was made for months, they sent the Halcyon to investigate. And Commander Ose had expected to find wreckage and a body, and instead she found a human man living among 10-foot-tall alien women and apparently starting a family. Ose was professional and thorough, and she walked through the settlement with her team, and she saw everything, and the pregnancies, and the aqueducts, and the library, and the integration of a human being into an alien civilization at the most fundamental level. And with every step, her expression grew harder. "You have violated every first contact protocol in the book," she said, when they were alone. "Every single one. And I have been in the Navy for 22 years, and I have never seen anything like this. And you are looking at a court-martial and prison and the end of your career, and everything you have built here will be classified and studied and taken apart." Elias stood before her, and he was calm, and he had known this moment might come, and he had made his peace with it long ago. "With respect, Commander, I am not leaving." Ose stared at him. "Court-martial me, and I accept the consequences, but I am not leaving my family, and I am not leaving these people. And what I have done here is not a violation, and it is not an experiment, and it is a choice I made to save a dying civilization, and I would make it again." Ose opened her mouth to respond, and then Thyra appeared. She came around the corner of the great hall, and she was enormous, and magnificent, and very, very pregnant. And behind her came Saluni and Cassivra and a dozen warriors, and they did not carry weapons, but their presence was unmistakable, and they stood behind Elias like a wall of bronze and gold. Saluni stepped forward, and she looked at Commander Ose, and she spoke, and the translation matrix carried her words with a dignity that made the air feel heavy. "Your people sent us a gift, and we will not allow you to take him back as though he were a mistake. And this man chose us, and we chose him, and what has been joined cannot be unjoined. And you may take his rank, and you may take his title, but you cannot take what he has given us, and you cannot take what we have given him." Ose looked at the matriarch, and then at Thyra, and then at the warriors, and then at Elias, and she was a soldier who had seen many things, but she had never seen anything like the look in these women's eyes. And it was the look of people who had been given back their future and would fight the entire galaxy to keep it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she turned to her second in command and said, "Log the following," and the survey corvette Sparrowhawk was lost with all hands during a reactor malfunction over Valera 4, and no survivors were recovered, and the planet is classified as culturally sensitive, and is hereby placed under non-contact protection status, effective immediately. Her second-in-command hesitated, and then nodded and entered the record. Osei looked at Elias one last time, and something softened in her face. And it was not much, but it was enough. "You know, Varn, they are going to write papers about this someday." Elias smiled and said, "Let them." Osei turned and walked back to her shuttle, and her team followed, and the engines fired, and the ship rose into the violet sky and disappeared. And just like that, Elias Varn was dead to the United Earth Navy, and alive in every way that mattered. That night, his daughter was born. Thyra labored for hours, and the healers attended her, and Elias held her hand, or rather, she held his entire arm. And when the baby finally came into the world, the cry that filled the hall was strong and clear and loud, and it was the most beautiful sound Elias had ever heard. She was Veliani in form, with bronze skin and golden eyes, and she was already longer than Elias's arm, and when he held her, she gripped his finger with a strength that would leave a bruise for days, and he looked into her face and saw Thyra's fierce beauty, and his own stubborn spark staring back at him. They named her Elune, which meant first star. In the months and years that followed, more children came, and each one was different, and each one was strong, and the Alory clan grew in ways that had nothing to do with numbers, and the diversity that Elias had brought to their bloodline rippled outward through the generations, and the sickness faded, and the frailty disappeared, and the children ran and climbed and fought and laughed with a vitality that the oldest elders had only seen in the earliest days. Ancient carvings. The settlement transformed as well, and the aqueducts expanded, and the windmills multiplied, and the library grew until it filled an entire hall. And Veliani scholars began to develop their own writing and their own science, and they did not abandon their traditions, but wove them together with new knowledge, the way two rivers merge into something wider and stronger. Elias grew older, and his hair turned gray, and his joints ached in the morning, and he was still the smallest person in any room, but no one saw him that way anymore. And when he walked through the settlement, children ran to him, and warriors nodded with respect. And the matriarch, who was now Thyra herself, having taken the mantle after Selowine passed peacefully in her sleep, always saved a seat beside her for the little human who had changed everything. One evening many years later, Elias sat on the terrace where he and Thyra had first watched the Festival of New Stars, and the violet sky was fading to deep purple, and the first stars were appearing. And Thyra sat beside him with her hand resting gently over his, and they were comfortable in the silence, the way only people who have loved each other for a long time can be. Below them in the valley, their eldest daughter Elune climbed the highest peak, and she was 12 feet tall, with bronze skin and bright clever eyes that missed nothing. And she reached the summit, and looked up at the stars, and the wind caught her dark hair, and she stood there like a monument to everything her father and mother had built together. "I wonder what is up there," she whispered. And somewhere across the vast distance of space, on 100 different worlds, the answer waited for her, and all the daughters who would come after her. And the story was not ending, and it was only just beginning. Thyra squeezed his hand gently, careful not to break his fingers, as she always was, and Elias squeezed back, and they sat together in the fading light, watched their daughter reach for the sky, and the mountain held them all.